the environment you stepped into was like.
Okay. Where I arrived in Hancock County, Mississippi, that particular area was where the eye of the hurricane touched ground. New Orleans was a different situation. As we all know, the levees broke there, and that's what flooded everything and made such a mess. For the coastline along Mississippi, the main problem there was just total wreckage and devastation. The houses were completely wiped off the face of the shoreline in most places, and so, driving the car along the highway and getting there and just seeing the trees sideways. There were there's a certain stretch that you drive through that's a national preserve or a park. There were dead boars and dead alligators, alligators, it's alligators, not crocodiles. Alligators all over the road, there weren't any birds. I remember that so well. I remember thinking every morning, there's not a single bird. It's not a sound of a bird. And then I arrived at night, and I woke up the next morning, and I remember walking down the street to where the ocean was and just looking around and being in complete and total shock because it was so wrecked. And huge houses, big buildings just leveled. And Bay St. Louis, the town of Bay St. Louis, is kind of a historic little town. It's also an artist community. There were 200 artists living and working there. It's also the highest point of elevation on the Gulf Coast. Actually, I think all the way from Florida to Louisiana, which is like 36 or 38 feet above sea level. So there were houses there that were actually still standing in this one tiny little patch, and then on either side of it, and past Christiane and all the way to Waveland, nothing. So you looked at an aerial photograph of it, and everything had been pushed by the storm surge and the wind, driven water up to a certain point and just dumped. So you would drive up, you would see very empty, everything gone, and then drive up a few blocks and see 4 houses on one lot. So you would see the roof peaks of, all of these houses stuck on one place. So there was aerially, there was this whole stripe of just insane amounts of junk, crap, everything, cars, bathtubs, boats, houses, all pushed into this one mound. And then right behind it, you saw all the houses that were just standing in wreckage. So roofs blown off or flooded out or whatever. And it was shocking how far back it went, too. And there's also the bay. So where it wraps around the bay, back on that side of it, they got 40 feet of water. So when you look at the elevated point in Bay St. Louis, you see these guys only got 4 feet of water. They were right on the edge. Cut that out. They were right on the edge, and they only got 4 feet of water only because they were 35 feet above sea level. So right down the way, 40 feet of water came through and pushed it all back. I don't know if that answered what you wanted.
Yeah, where was Disaster Corps set up, and what was that scenario looking like?
Well, it was quite a struggle. Because we weren't coming from a background with a lot of experience and high profile, or the meat that all the churches have behind them with all the money and all the manpower coming down there from the Baptist churches and the Mormon churches and everything. We had to struggle quite a bit to get a staging area, and I became a bit of a thorn in the side and nagged and begged to share a baseball field with a group called City Team Ministries out of San Francisco that runs homeless shelters here and does outreach programs for people who've been incarcerated and had drug problems and stuff. And so they had lots of folks that they brought there from their programs in San Francisco. And I think it was actually a really, really interesting idea, and it worked out very well for them. It was a good form of therapy for the individuals, and But it is definitely a faith-based organization. So I had to explain to them and cajole them and promise them that we would be a lovely group of individuals to share their space with. And finally, they were persuaded to do so. So we got a corner of the ball field where they had a very large distribution center, and they continue to have a presence in Bay St. Louis, although it's scaled back considerably. But they did a great job distributing in that area. So we had our small group and cluster of tents set up, and shower tents, and we actually had access to 2 toilets, but mostly portalettes, and all of our eating was done in the various feeding centers that were set up. We were not in a position to feed our people, and luckily that continued long enough until we actually did get a kitchen set up. But people would come and camp on the grounds. We kind of had to limit the number of people that were there. Also because personally I couldn't handle huge groups of individuals and find work for them to do. I had to have team leaders in place, and we had very few resident volunteers. I think at any given time maybe 5 was the most that we had. Most people would only come and stay for a few days or a week.
Let me ask you how you saw were you surprised by the federal and state versus local or grassroots response to the storm? Did you expect more from the government?
Originally, I'm all thoroughly registered and signed up and everything with the Red Cross, and that was originally who I tried to go through, and that was such a junk show that I was just absolutely disgusted. And it was the same thing that happened to me in Indonesia. So much bureaucracy and red tape and whatever. And the presence of the Red Cross, I literally myself, being there, saw the feeding wagon going around and feeding volunteers and feeding families on a daily basis. But that was really all I saw from their presence and all I saw them doing. I am unaware, so I cannot say that that's all they did. I would hope that they did more, because I think they received more money than anyone else. But we were always wondering what they did with it and what actually it was going to, because it certainly wasn't going into any rebuilding projects. It wasn't going into any house cleaning projects. That was the thing that impressed me the most. I give enormous amounts of credit to the churches that went down there and just, with their own money and their own manpower and getting their own parishioners or volunteers or whatever to come down and just work. It was basically cleanup that needed to be done, and the essentials of feeding and clothing and making sure that people had, this was long before FEMA trailers were arriving, and people were living in tents and people were living in cars. And, the groups, I think, that made the real effort to make sure that people had something to eat or had ice or had blankets were the grassroots organizations and the churches, for sure.
What sort of federal response did you see? Were you surprised by what you did see? I mean, not the Red Cross, but FEMA and National Guard, whomever.
The National Guard presence in New Orleans is I didn't spend an enormous amount of time there, but I do know that at a certain point it was necessary, and I think that they kept a certain amount of control. I know that it was agonizing for people not to be allowed to go back and see if their house was still standing, but I guess it was necessary for safety issues or reasons. I didn't see a National Guard presence in Mississippi. As far as FEMA goes, I've had continual battles with them to try and get small things like fuel and, whatever. What I saw FEMA doing more than anything else was setting up, areas where people could come in and fill out forms and papers and get their $2,000 and sign up for their trailer. That was what I saw them do. I also saw them encourage certain groups to move along and lead.